There's a street in this country where a pharmacy sign still hangs above a locked door. The parking lot out front is empty, has been for years. Snow fills the cracks in the asphalt. A motel nearby has its letters half fallen off. The kind of sign that once meant something to someone driving through in the dark, looking for a place to stop. This city still exists on the map, but nobody chooses to live here anymore. What happens to a place when the world decides it's no longer worth the effort? That's the question that runs underneath everything you're about to hear. Because across this country, the one sold to the world as clean air, open doors, and second chances, there are places that were left behind in very specific ways, not by accident, not by time alone, by decisions. Someone decided to pull the railroad. Someone decided to cancel the flights. Someone decided to look the other way when the water turned. Someone decided that certain lives, in certain places, simply didn't require the same urgency as others. 10 cities, 10 reasons, each one more uncomfortable than the last. Number 10. Canso, Nova Scotia. If you look at a map of Nova Scotia's eastern tip, you'll find Canso sitting right at the edge, one of the oldest continuously settled fishing communities in North America. People have been pulling fish out of these waters since the 1500s. Generations. Families that measured their lives in seasons and catches, in boats and cold mornings and the smell of salt that never quite leaves your clothes. At its height, Canso was a working town. Not glamorous, but alive. God was the backbone of everything. The economy, the calendar, the identity. Then the cod collapsed. And here's what makes Canso different from a simple story of resource depletion. The Canadian government had access to data showing the North Atlantic cod stocks were in free fall for decades before the 1992 moratorium. Decades. Fisheries scientists were filing warnings through the 70s and 80s. Those warnings moved slowly through bureaucracies, got softened in reports, got weighed against the political cost of acting too soon. By the time the moratorium came, it was too late for the fish, and too late for towns like Canso. 30,000 jobs gone from Atlantic Canada almost overnight. The moratorium was the right call, but it arrived long after the moment when it could have been part of a managed transition. Canso has never recovered. Population has been bleeding out ever since. The dock is quieter every year. The town persists, but barely. A fishing community in a place where the fishing is gone. What lingers here isn't just loss. It's the particular kind of grief that comes from knowing that someone, somewhere, saw it coming. Number 9. Leaf Rapids, Manitoba. Some places collapse because something was taken away. Leaf Rapids collapsed because it was built on a premise that turned out to be temporary. In the early 1970s, the Manitoba government commissioned a planned community from scratch to support a new copper-zinc mine nearby. Leaf Rapids was designed by architects and urban planners, a modernist experiment in the subarctic. It had a covered shopping mall, a recreation center, housing designed for the northern climate. It was supposed to be proof that you could build a real, functional, permanent community in the Canadian North through sheer will and good planning. For a while it worked. Families came, kids grew up there. The mall, the Leaf Rapids town center, became the social hub of the entire region. People actually liked living there, which was not something the planners had necessarily guaranteed. Then the mine closed in 2002. The town didn't vanish overnight. People stayed, tried to hold on. The mall kept a few tenants. But the fundamental premise of the place, that it existed to support an industry, had expired. What's strange about Leaf Rapids isn't the decline. It's the design. You can still see the bones of the original vision. The sheltered walkways, the integrated civic spaces. The kind of careful thinking that usually precedes a place people love. And yet it's emptying. It turns out that good urban design doesn't immunize a town against the economics of mining. You can plan for everything except for the moment someone decides the ore isn't worth it anymore. Number 8. Flin Flon, Manitoba, Saskatchewan. Flin Flon is one of those places that sounds like it was invented. And in some ways, it was. Named after a fictional prospector from a dime store novel that a real prospector happened to be reading when he found the ore body in 1915. It sits on the border between Manitoba and Saskatchewan, which means it technically exists in two provinces simultaneously. The provincial line runs straight through the middle of town. For most of the 20th century, Flin Flon meant copper and zinc. Hudson Bay Mining and Smelting built the town, owned the town, and for decades operated as the economic atmosphere the entire community breathed. The smelter closed in 2010. The mine itself kept going longer, but the trajectory was clear, and everyone there knew it. What makes Flin Flon worth watching now is that it's not dead. It's shrinking. Slowly, steadily, measurably. The population has dropped by roughly a third since the peak. Businesses close, families leave, the school enrollment falls. It's a town watching itself thin out from the inside, trying to find a reason to exist that doesn't depend on the ground beneath it. The provincial border, which once seemed like a quirky geographical detail, now feels almost symbolic. Flin Flon has always existed between two places, and as it empties, you start to wonder which province will ultimately be left holding it. Number 7. Elliott Lake, Ontario. For a moment, a real, measurable moment, Elliott Lake looked like it had solved the problem every mining town faces. After uranium production wound down in the 1990s, the city reinvented itself. It positioned itself as a retirement destination. Affordable housing in a clean northern setting, good amenities for the price, a place where a modest Canadian pension could go a long way. And it worked. People came. The population stabilized. The story became a case study in economic reinvention. Then, on June 23, 2012, the roof of the Algo Center Mall collapsed. 2 people died. A rescue operation that stretched over days became a national story, and not for hopeful reasons. The collapse had been preceded by years of known leaks and structural concerns. Reports had flagged issues. The warnings hadn't translated into action fast enough. The physical collapse of that building somehow mirrored the collapse of the reinvention narrative. Not immediately, not dramatically, but the confidence in Elliott Lake's future had rested on a fragile foundation, and that became harder to ignore after the rubble was cleared. People still live in Elliott Lake. The retirement community didn't disappear, but the ambition contracted. The sense that this was a model for something larger, that faded with the dust. Number 6. Port Alice, British Columbia. Port Alice is small enough that you might miss it even if you're looking. A pulp mill town on the northwest coast of Vancouver Island, built around a single operation, surviving on the logic that the mill would always be there. The mill changed hands 3 times in roughly 5 years in the early 2000s. Each new owner arrived with restructuring language and efficiency targets. Each departure left behind a community a little more uncertain about the next round. What Port Alice revealed about the company town model is something that residents probably always sensed but couldn't name while the mill was running. In a single industry town, the residents aren't really citizens in the civic sense. They're inputs. They live where the labor is needed. When the calculus changes, when it's cheaper to source fiber differently, or operate elsewhere, or simply close, the community's needs don't appear in the balance sheet. This isn't cynicism, it's just what the ownership changes made visible. The mill ultimately survived in reduced form, but the years of uncertainty did permanent damage to the community's confidence in its own future. Young people left. Why wait around to find out? Port Alice didn't die, but it stopped believing in itself, which is a different kind of ending. Number 5. Oromocto area, New Brunswick. PFAS contamination. This one requires a little patience. Because the story is slow in the way that the worst stories often are. For decades, military bases across Canada used firefighting foam containing PFAS, per, and polyfluoroalkyl substances. These compounds do not break down. They move through soil, enter groundwater, and stay. Communities near Canadian Forces Base Gagetown in New Brunswick have been raising concerns about contamination for years. Testing confirmed PFAS levels in local water sources. The timeline of who knew what and when, and what was done about it. That timeline is still being assembled in legal proceedings and government reviews. What is clear is that the gap between the first concerns and substantive action was measured in years that people were drinking water, growing gardens, raising children near affected areas. The contamination didn't empty these communities the way a mine closure empties a company town. People don't always leave when the water is poisoned. Sometimes they can't afford to. Sometimes they don't know yet. Sometimes they fight to stay. But properties lose value. Trust in institutions hollows out. The invisible damage accumulates. There's something specifically modern about this kind of abandonment. No locked gate, no announcement, no date you can point to. Just a slow realization that the ground you built your life on was compromised, and that the people who could have told you sooner didn't. Number 4. Uranium City, Saskatchewan. Uranium City had 5,000 people at its peak. Today, somewhere between 50 and 100 remain. That's not a typo, and it didn't happen gradually. When the El Dorado uranium mine closed in 1982, the provincial government of Saskatchewan made a calculation. Maintaining subsidized flights and services to a remote northern community no longer built around a functioning industry was expensive. So they cut the flights. Think about what that means geographically. Uranium City is not accessible by road. There is no highway in. The only way out, the only way to get groceries, medical care, supplies of any kind on a reliable schedule, was the air service. When that ended, the community didn't just lose convenience. It lost its connection to the world. Most people left quickly. They had to. The ones who stayed were making a choice that most of us will never fully understand from the outside. Staying in a place that had been, in the most practical sense, disconnected from the country that was supposed to include it. The town still appears on maps. The buildings are still there, or what's left of them. A few dozen people hold on for reasons that are private and complex and not really ours to judge. What the government did to Uranium City wasn't dramatic. There was no explosion, no disaster, no single moment of failure. There was just a spreadsheet and a decision, and then silence where the plains used to be. Number 3, Schefferville, Quebec. When the Iron Ore Company of Canada decided to close its operations in Schefferville in 1982, they didn't just close the mine, they took the railroad. Not metaphorically, literally. The rail lines connecting Schefferville to the rest of Quebec were pulled up. The tracks were physically removed. The infrastructure that had made the town possible in the first place. The thing that preceded everything else, that allowed people to arrive and supplies to come in and ore to go out, was dismantled. It is hard to think of a clearer statement of intent. Schefferville had been built entirely by and for the mining operation. When the company left, there was no pretense that the town might continue independently. The railroad removal made sure of it. What's complicated is that Schefferville wasn't only a company town. 2 Innu communities, Matimekushlag John and Kawawachikamak, existed there and continue to exist there today. They didn't have the option of simply following the company south. Their land, their community, their home was there. The mine left. The tracks left. The Innu stayed. The dismantling of Schefferville's infrastructure is often told as an economic story. A corporation made an exit. But sitting underneath that story, largely unexamined in the decades since, is the question of what it means to remove access infrastructure from communities that had no say in whether it was built, and no alternative when it was gone. Number 2. Attawapiskat, Ontario. Attawapiskat has entered the national news enough times that the name carries its own weight now. Housing crisis, state of emergency, suicide crisis. These words have appeared next to Attawapiskat in headlines going back years, going back decades really, if you read the older reports. It sits on the western shore of James Bay in northern Ontario. No road access for most of the year. A fly-in community. James Bay Treaty signed in 1905. The De Beers Victor Diamond Mine operated nearby from 2008 to 2019, one of the richest diamond deposits in Canadian history, while the community beside it declared emergencies over housing so inadequate that families were living in structures without heat or running water. That proximity, a billion-dollar mine and a community in declared emergency on the same land, is not incidental. It is the story. Attawapiskat doesn't belong on a list of dying towns in the usual sense. The people aren't leaving because the industry left. The conditions have persisted through boom and bust both. The real story is a century of treaty obligations incompletely honored, of Indigenous governance constrained and second-guessed, of emergency after emergency being met with investigations and audits and temporary fixes, rather than the structural investment that everyone in the relevant ministries knew was needed. When a suicide crisis among young people in a remote community makes the news, it generates attention for about 72 hours. Then something else happens. Then the attention moves on. Then the next crisis comes. Then the cycle repeats. This isn't the story of a town that lost its industry. This is the story of a community that was never fully included in the country that claims its land, and the very specific, very patient silence that has maintained that exclusion for over 100 years. Number 1, Pikangikum, Ontario. For several years running in the late 2000s and early 2010s, Pikangikum had the highest youth suicide rate of any community in the world. Not in Canada, not in North America, in the world. It's a First Nation of roughly 2,000 people, also on the Northern Ontario fly-in circuit, also without year-round road access, also carrying a history shaped by residential schools, by the removal of children, by the systematic dismantling of the cultural structures that give a community its internal coherence, its sense of who it is and what it's for. No sewage system for much of this period. Chronic housing overcrowding, limited mental health services, and an isolation so complete that even in crisis, the logistics of getting help in or getting people out were formidable obstacles in themselves. What happened in Pikangikum was not a mystery. It was the predictable outcome of predictable conditions that had been allowed to persist for decades by governments that had the information, had the legal obligations, and made different choices about where to allocate attention and resources and urgency. This is the number 1 entry not because Pikangikum is the most visually dramatic, not because the ruins are most photogenic, not because the economic collapse is most total. It's number 1 because the reason people aren't choosing to build lives there isn't geological, isn't industrial, isn't accidental. It is political, it is structural, and it has been, in the plainest sense, a choice. Not a choice made on one day, in one room, by one person. A choice made continuously, renewed in budget after budget, policy after policy, emergency after emergency, handled as if it were an isolated incident rather than the predictable result of a system operating exactly as designed. 10 cities, 10 reasons, and underneath all of them, one pattern. The emptying of a place is never just geography. It's not erosion, it's not entropy, it's not the neutral passage of time. Behind every locked storefront and every overgrown lot, and every school that closed for lack of children, there is a decision. Most of the time, that decision was made by people who did not live there, and would not bear the consequences of getting it wrong. Canada is a country that spends considerable energy on its own image, the clean water, the open spaces, the reputation for decency. And that image isn't false, exactly. but it is incomplete in ways that these 10 places make visible. If you finish this list and feel something like discomfort, good. That's the right response. Not guilt as a performance, not outrage as a gesture, but the specific discomfort of recognizing something true about a system you are part of, that operates in your name, that produces these outcomes with a consistency that is very hard to call accidental. Every map of Canada shows the same borders, but not every point inside those borders experiences the same country. Some places know that better than any of us would like to admit.